August 17, 1944. Somewhere on the rolling hills of northern France, near the shattered outskirts of Caen, a thick, humid mist clung to the hedgerows, muffling the distant roar of artillery and the occasional shriek of an aircraft cutting through the clouds. Inside the cramped turret of a Panther tank, Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann wiped sweat from his brow, the grime of battle smearing across his face like charcoal. His hands gripped the controls with a tension born of both exhaustion and anticipation. Outside, the landscape was a chaotic patchwork of destruction. Farmhouses had been reduced to skeletons of timber and stone, shell craters scarred the muddy fields, and blackened trees leaned at unnatural angles, their roots clawing uselessly at the scarred earth. Hoffmann's tank, a gleaming steel predator of the Wehrmacht, sat quietly, its engine idling with a low, ominous hum. Every so often he could hear the distant clatter of trucks, long lines of them rumbling relentlessly across the countryside. At first, Hoffmann had tried to dismiss them. "Supply trucks," he muttered to his gunner Unteroffizier Franz Becker, squinting through the periscope. "Nothing we can't handle." But day after day, hour after hour, the endless tide of American vehicles seemed to stretch on forever. Each truck was a moving arsenal: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. The soldiers in the cab waved and laughed, oblivious to the German armor hiding in the hedgerows, unaware they were fueling the machine that would eventually crush the Wehrmacht's defenses. Hoffmann rotated the turret slowly, scanning the horizon. "Another convoy," he said, voice low, almost in disbelief. Becker nodded, his own eyes wide behind the goggles, trying to track the serpentine line of trucks that threaded their way through the shattered villages. Tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, sometimes even armored cars streamed past in a relentless rhythmic pulse. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, and it was exactly that, a thunderous, unstoppable red line on the map, designed to keep Patton's advancing army fed, armed and moving. Inside the Panther, every minor sound was amplified. The clank of metal against metal as Hoffmann adjusted the turret, the low rumble of the tracks as they shifted in the mud, the muffled cough of the radio operator trying to intercept communications from the American convoys. Outside, the wind carried the smell of diesel, baked earth, and the occasional acrid tang of spent shells. Hoffmann's stomach twisted, not from hunger but from the creeping realization that these trucks were more than just vehicles. They were the beating heart of a war machine that no single tank, no matter how formidable, could hope to stop alone. By mid-morning, Hoffmann's radio crackled with a terse report from the neighboring unit. "All attempts to cut the supply line have failed," the voice said, clipped and strained. "Convoys keep coming. Reinforcements are endless." He let the words sink in. Endless. That single adjective echoed in his mind like a tolling bell. His eyes returned to the fields, scanning for any sign of a vulnerability, an exposed convoy, a chance to strike. But the Americans moved with a precision and confidence that was almost robotic. There was no pause, no hesitation, only the continuous motion of trucks carrying the lifeblood of the Allied advance. Hoffmann's men felt it too. Sergeant Wilhelm Klein, his loader, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the same mounting dread. "They can't stop," he muttered under his breath, half to himself, half to the shadows of the turret. "We can't stop them. Not alone." The words hung in the air, mingling with the distant gunfire and the relentless drone of engines. Hoffmann swallowed hard, knowing that if they stayed here, the tanks, the guns, the hedgerows, they would all eventually be overrun by sheer numbers, by the inexorable flow of American logistics. And in that moment, as yet another convoy disappeared over a distant rise, Karl Hoffmann realized the terrifying truth. The war in France wasn't just about tanks or artillery. It was about supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, and men. And the Americans had more of all of it than he could ever hope to destroy. August 18th, 1944. The sun had burned off the early mist, revealing a countryside that looked almost peaceful from a distance, fields of golden wheat bending in the breeze, the occasional distant church steeple standing stubbornly among the rubble. But for Karl Hoffmann and his crew, there was no serenity here. The quiet was only deceptive, masking the constant, grinding presence of the Red Ball Express convoys that stretched like rivers of steel across northern France. Hoffmann shifted the Panther into position behind a low ridge, the tank's tracks churning mud as it moved with a deliberate caution born of repeated near misses. He peered through the gun sight, eyes narrowing. A convoy appeared over the crest, jeeps leading, trucks loaded with crates, artillery rounds rattling in the backs, soldiers slouched in the cabs waving casually as if they were on a training exercise rather than racing through a war zone. "Target the lead truck," Hoffmann ordered, his voice tight with controlled tension. Becker adjusted the sight, taking careful aim. The main gun rumbled as it fired, a deafening blast that made the turret shake. The projectile struck the truck, flipping it onto its side in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. For a heartbeat, the German crew felt a surge of satisfaction. But then reality slammed back. 2 more trucks immediately took its place. No pause, no hesitation, and the soldiers climbed out unscathed, redirecting the convoy as if nothing had happened. Hoffmann's heart sank. "Another 10 minutes and they'll be past us," he muttered, a creeping despair threading through his words. The convoy pressed on relentlessly. Every strike they made was insignificant in the grand tide of the Red Ball Express. No matter how skilled he was, no matter how accurate the Panther's gun, the Americans had numbers, and more importantly, logistics on their side. Each destroyed truck was replaced by 2 more. Each moment of German aggression met with a methodical, coordinated response from the American drivers. The crew grew restless. Klein, the loader, slammed the interior of the turret with a fistful of spent shell casings. "We're chasing ghosts," he hissed. "Ghosts that just keep coming." Becker's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the turret's aim again, his jaw tight. Outside, the countryside was alive with the movement of vehicles, the rumble of engines blending with the distant thump of artillery. The Americans seemed to glide over the shattered terrain effortlessly, as if the destruction around them had no effect, as if the shell craters and bombed-out villages existed merely as scenic obstacles to their advance. Hoffmann tried to formulate a plan. He considered intercepting the convoy further down the road. Using ambush tactics he had relied on countless times in the Eastern Front, but the reports over the radio confirmed what his eyes already told him. Reinforcements were moving faster than he could predict. Trucks came in waves, jeeps zipped ahead scouting routes, and tank destroyers patrolled alongside the convoys. Every attempt at disruption was neutralized almost immediately, leaving the Panther sitting like an immobile sentinel, firing into a sea of inexhaustible supplies. By midday, fatigue and frustration had begun to weigh heavily on Hoffmann's crew. The scorching sun reflected off the steel of their tank, baking the interior, thickening the tension. "How many more?" Klein whispered, almost to himself, staring out through the vision slit at the endless procession. "How many can they bring?" Hoffmann said nothing. He knew the answer, enough to make victory impossible, enough to render every tactical maneuver, every daring shot, utterly meaningless. As the convoy disappeared into the distance, leaving a faint dust cloud behind, Hoffmann slumped against the turret wall, the heavy realization settling like lead in his stomach. He could destroy trucks, he could kill soldiers, but he could not stop the flow. And that flow, that endless, unstoppable river of trucks and supplies, was the lifeblood of the American advance. If it continued unabated, every German defensive line would eventually crumble. Not from bravery, not from strategy, but from sheer logistical might. Hoffmann's gaze drifted to the horizon, where another convoy was already forming, waiting its turn to roll forward. He finally whispered aloud, almost to the tank itself, "They have too much. We can't win." Outside, the world continued moving, engines, wheels, men, supplies. And inside the Panther, a grim silence fell, filled only with the low, constant hum of inevitability. August 19th, 1944. The morning fog clung to the hedgerows like a shroud, softening the edges of the war-torn countryside, but doing nothing to mask the relentless rumble of American convoys. Karl Hoffmann and his crew crouched in the shadow of a shattered farmhouse, the Panther partially concealed by a collapsed stone wall and overgrown brambles. His hands were slick with sweat and grime, every sense straining to detect movement in the thickening mist. Franz Becker, the gunner, squinted through the periscope. "They're coming again," he whispered, voice tight with both fear and awe. From the ridge ahead, the glint of sunlight on metal confirmed it. Another endless stream of trucks, jeeps, and armored personnel carriers snaked through the shattered fields like a living organism. Hoffmann felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. Every convoy carried food, ammunition, fuel, replacement parts, and soldiers. Every truck that passed was one more brick in the wall of American operational dominance. Hoffmann's mind raced. He had fought in countless engagements, ambushes, and counterattacks, but this logistical tide was something different. Something unstoppable. "We'll try the hedgerow tactic," he ordered, his voice low, authoritative. "Hit and fade. Don't engage the entire convoy." Klein, the loader, gritted his teeth. "And what then, Herr Oberleutnant? They just keep coming. We won't even slow them down." Hoffmann said nothing. He knew Klein was right. Yet he had no choice but to try, because hesitation was death. The Panther moved with deliberate stealth along the muddy lanes, hugging the hedgerows like a predator stalking prey. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, diesel exhaust, and the faint acrid tang of spent shells. Birds, unnervingly silent, scattered into the sky as the tank lurched forward. Hoffmann could feel every vibration of the tracks through the hull, every tremor of anticipation in the armored steel that encased him. Suddenly, the first targets appeared, a pair of trucks at the rear of the convoy, slightly separated from the main body. Hoffmann's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun fired, a thunderous roar echoing through the hedgerows. The trucks erupted in flames, metal twisting and black smoke billowing upward. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the crew's eyes. They had scored a hit. But then the realization returned like a cold wind. More trucks were already streaming past unaffected, keeping the momentum. The Americans barely slowed, redirecting vehicles and maintaining formation with an eerie precision. Hours dragged on like this. Hoffmann's Panther prowled from one hedgerow to another, firing in calculated bursts, only to see the sheer numbers of the Red Ball Express swallow each victory. Each strike, each destroyed truck was a fleeting triumph, immediately replaced by the next wave. By midday, the crew's nerves were frayed. Klein's hands shook as he loaded shells. Becker's jaw was clenched, white-knuckled on the controls. Hoffmann himself felt a creeping paralysis of the mind, a recognition that no amount of courage or skill could alter the strategic reality. In a rare moment of silence, Hoffmann whispered to himself, almost as if speaking to the land itself, "They can't be stopped. They're everywhere. We're too few, too late." Outside, the world moved with mechanical precision. Trucks shifted in and out of position. Drivers communicated through hand signals and radios. Mechanics changed tires and refueled on the fly. The Americans had built not just a convoy, but a living, breathing system, an industrial monster that the Germans could not hope to break with tanks alone. As dusk fell, the convoy finally began to thin, the last trucks disappearing over the distant ridge. Hoffmann allowed himself a brief exhale, but the relief was hollow. He knew that more would come tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. The Red Ball Express was not a force that paused. It was a perpetual motion machine, and the Wehrmacht's tanks, for all their firepower and armor, were mere stones in the path of an unstoppable current. Hoffmann leaned back against the steel of the Panther, exhaustion etching deep lines into his face. Around him, the hedgerows whispered in the wind as if mocking the futility of resistance. He could almost hear the distant engines, a constant heartbeat of inevitability. In that moment, he understood that the battle was no longer one of skill or bravery. It was a battle of supply and endurance, and the Germans were already losing. August 20th, 1944. The morning light crept over the shattered fields near St. Lo, casting long shadows across the scarred landscape. Karl Hoffmann adjusted the periscope of his Panther, peering into the horizon with eyes that had seen too much. Smoke from burning trucks still lingered in the air, carried in ribbons along the low hills, mixing with the tang of diesel and damp earth. The countryside seemed deceptively calm, but the distant hum of engines reminded him that the enemy never slept. Hoffmann's radio crackled again, a terse voice reporting more convoys forming further east. "They're coming from Cherbourg," the message said. "The supply chain is unbroken. Reinforcements are already moving." Hoffmann swallowed hard. He had watched the Red Ball Express operate day after day, and the sheer scale of it was staggering. Trucks in seemingly endless lines, drivers navigating bombed-out roads, maintenance crews working on the fly, all coordinated with ruthless precision. It was more than a military operation. It was a living organism. He gave orders to reposition the Panther along a narrow lane bordered by hedgerows, hoping to ambush a small group of vehicles. The tracks churned mud as the tank crept forward, the crew silent except for the low rumble of the engine. Franz Becker, scanning through the gun sight, murmured, "Too many. Even if we take out a dozen, 100 more will follow." Hoffmann nodded grimly. He knew Becker was right. The Red Ball Express was designed to replace losses almost immediately. For every truck destroyed, 2 more would take its place. The first targets appeared, 3 trucks at the rear of a convoy, slightly straggling from the main formation. Hoffmann fired. The explosions lit the hedgerow in flickering orange, smoke curling toward the sky. For a moment, the crew felt a fleeting surge of hope. But then the remaining trucks surged forward, soldiers climbing out to reorganize the convoy, drivers adjusting routes, and the motion never faltered. It was a frustrating, terrifying spectacle. Victory reduced to a fleeting illusion, swallowed immediately by the sheer volume of American logistics. Klein slammed a shell into the loader's tray, frustration etched into every movement. "It's useless," he hissed. "We can't even slow them down." Hoffmann clenched his jaw. He had faced impossible odds before, but never like this. Never an enemy that could erase every gain in minutes. Never a force whose lifeblood was a supply chain too vast to disrupt. The realization gnawed at him. Tanks, artillery, even infantry could be defeated, but an unbroken, relentless supply line? That was untouchable. Hours passed, the convoy crawling through the shattered countryside. Hoffmann fired sporadically, choosing his shots with care, targeting trucks carrying fuel or ammunition. Each hit felt like a small defiance against the inevitable, but the effect was almost imperceptible. Behind every destroyed vehicle, more surged forward, a testament to the American logistical machine. Hoffmann's hands were slick with sweat, his face grimy and strained, eyes burning from the periscope. Every glance at the horizon reinforced a bitter truth. The Germans were not merely outgunned, they were out-resourced. By late afternoon, Hoffmann allowed the Panther to withdraw to a safer position, ducking behind a ruined farmhouse. The crew slumped in silence, exhaustion and despair pressing down. The endless noise of engines, the distant thumps of artillery, and the ever-present smell of diesel and burning rubber created a sensory weight that seemed inescapable. Hoffmann knew that no matter how many trucks they destroyed, the Red Ball Express would continue. It was tireless, relentless, and unstoppable. As night fell, Hoffmann sat in the Panther turret, staring at the distant lights of convoys moving in the darkness like fireflies on the horizon. He thought of the soldiers inside those trucks, drivers, mechanics, and support crews, who would keep the American advance moving while German units struggled to hold the line. The hopelessness was suffocating, but it was clear. Victory was no longer measured in territory or destroyed vehicles. Victory depended on disrupting the supply, and the Germans had already failed. Hoffmann finally whispered to no one in particular, voice low and hollow. "We can't win. Not against this. Not ever." Outside, the distant hum of engines continued, a mechanical heartbeat that would not stop. August 21st, 1944. The dawn sky over the Normandy countryside was streaked with gray clouds, promising another day of heat and dust. Karl Hoffmann sat in the turret of his Panther, scanning the horizon through the periscope. The early morning calm was deceptive. In the distance, the unmistakable line of headlights and the low hum of engines announced the next wave of Red Ball Express convoys. Each vehicle carried the lifeblood of the American advance, fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, food for soldiers, and the promise of more reinforcements around the bend. Hoffmann's crew had begun to sense the futility of their situation. Franz Becker, usually precise and confident, spoke quietly, almost to himself. "We can't touch them all. Not a single one." The words hung in the confined space of the turret like smoke. Even Klein, the usually fiery loader, had gone quiet, staring into the periscope with a mixture of fear and resignation. They had fought bravely for weeks, but the relentless scale of American logistics was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The Panther moved forward along a narrow hedgerow path, carefully chosen for concealment and potential ambush. Hoffmann's strategy was simple: pick off a small group of trucks, strike quickly, then disappear before reinforcements could respond. But as the first convoy came into view, a cold realization gripped him. Even a perfectly executed ambush would be a drop in an ocean. Every destroyed truck was immediately replaced by another. The American supply network, a machine that seemed to repair itself in real time. He fired at the lead vehicle. The explosion lit the hedgerow in fire and smoke. The truck flipped, flames consuming the canvas cover and supplies. For a brief, fleeting moment, the crew felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was short-lived. The following trucks slowed only slightly, then surged forward, their drivers unfazed. Mechanized infantry dismounted from nearby vehicles, securing the wreckage and ensuring the convoy's momentum never faltered. Hoffmann's hands shook slightly on the controls. "They just keep coming," he muttered, voice tight. Every shot he fired felt increasingly meaningless. Each destroyed vehicle, each injured soldier, was immediately offset by the sheer weight of numbers moving inexorably forward. The reality was undeniable. The Red Ball Express was not just a supply line. It was a fortress in motion, an unbroken artery of American military might. By midday, the relentless tide had worn down the Panther crew. Sweat ran down Hoffmann's face, his uniform damp and streaked with dirt. The thunder of engines, the clatter of metal, the low murmur of voices in the convoys outside, it all merged into a single oppressive pulse. Each rumble was a reminder of their helplessness. The Germans had tanks, artillery, and soldiers. Yes, but what they lacked was the one thing the Americans had in abundance: endless supply. Hoffmann finally sat back against the steel of the turret, eyes scanning the endless horizon. A convoy stretched as far as he could see, trucks glinting in the sun, moving with mechanical precision. He realized something chilling. This was not a momentary advantage. This was the new reality of modern warfare. No heroics, no clever ambush could change it. The Americans had built a war machine that was self-sustaining, efficient and inexhaustible. And he, Hoffmann, was powerless to stop it. For the first time, Karl Hoffmann allowed himself a private thought, spoken quietly, almost as a confession to the empty turret. "We can fight all we want, but we can't win, not here, not ever against this." The Red Ball Express rolled on, a relentless tide of wheels and men, a symbol of a conflict won not by valor alone, but by the unstoppable power of logistics. August 22, 1944. The late afternoon sun cast long, harsh shadows across the Normandy fields, illuminating the twisted remnants of villages and roads pocked with shell craters. Karl Hoffmann sat in the turret of his Panther, the armor hot beneath his hands, his uniform soaked in sweat. The distant rumble of American engines was constant, a mechanical heartbeat that refused to slow. Hoffmann could feel it in his chest, a relentless reminder of the impossible odds. He had watched another convoy pass, their rhythm unbroken, the men inside laughing and shouting over the engine noise, oblivious to the Panther hidden in the hedgerows. Fuel, ammunition, rations, each truck carrying the lifeblood that kept Patton's advance moving. Hoffmann had fired, maneuvered, ambushed, and yet the convoy continued as if untouched, an endless wave that mocked every German effort. Inside the Panther, the crew was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Franz Becker leaned against the gun sight, his face pale, eyes tracking the receding vehicles. Klein rested his head on his arms, jaw tight, resigned. Hoffmann's hands rested lightly on the controls. A man who had come to a bitter understanding. No amount of bravery, skill, or strategy could change the reality of what he faced. The Americans' logistical advantage was absolute. Their capacity to replace men, fuel, and material far outstripped anything the Wehrmacht could achieve in France. He radioed the other units in the sector, his voice steady but tinged with grim acceptance. "All units, withdraw to secondary positions. The supply lines are unbreakable. We cannot hold this ground." Outside, the American convoy rolled on, oblivious and unstoppable, a river of steel and determination that no tank, no ambush could dam. Hoffmann felt the weight of this truth settle over him like lead. The battle was no longer about tanks, guns, or courage. It was about logistics. And in that war, they were already defeated. As the Panther retreated along muddy tracks, Hoffmann looked back one last time at the trail of trucks disappearing over the distant ridge. Smoke curled from a few wrecked vehicles, but the convoy moved forward with the same inexorable rhythm as before. The landscape itself seemed to bow to the unstoppable march of American supply lines. Each wheel, each engine, each soldier aboard those trucks was part of a force that could not be slowed by any single act of heroism. By nightfall, Hoffmann and his crew had withdrawn to a more secure location. The countryside was quiet now, the distant hum of engines fading into the dark. Hoffmann sat atop the Panther turret, the metal warm under the stars reflecting the dim moonlight. He thought of the endless convoys, the supplies, the men who would continue to pour into the front lines tomorrow and the day after. There was no illusion left. They could fight, they could resist, they could survive, but they could not win. He finally spoke aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper carried away by the wind. We did what we could, but it is not enough, not here, not ever. The Panther engine idled softly beneath him, a quiet companion to the truth that had settled in his heart. Outside, the world continued to move, trucks, men, and supplies advancing steadily toward victory. And in that moment, Karl Hoffmann understood the most painful lesson of all. Wars are not won by courage alone, but by the power to sustain it.